The Natural Resources Committee of the League of Women Voters of Snohomish County welcomes you to Evergreen Tuesdays tonight. With climate change and its impacts becoming more apparent daily, we would like to share with you not only a call to action, but some positive thoughts for moving forward. 3 speakers, Ben Thompson tonight and our own Kate Lunsford, as well as Lisa DeLude next Tuesday, the 16th, will offer you ideas that can move us towards sustainability. These ideas are aimed at you, the public, citizen, community leader, gardener, property owner, our valued individual. Please take them to heart tonight. A few housekeeping reminders. Set your view image to speaker. You will be muted, but put your questions into the chat as they occur. Ben will answer at the end of the question and answer, during a question and answer period. And at that time, signal your question by the hand raise feature in the reaction section. And now a few words from our League President, Jean Crevier.
Thank you, Joan, and good evening, everyone. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that for nearly 102 years has encouraged the informed and active participation of citizens in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we influence public policy through education and advocacy. As far back as the 1920s, the League has acted upon its concern for the conservation of natural resources when it studied flood control and erosion. A continuation of that work is tonight's discussion on urban trees, steps to sustainability. Thank you for being with us and for being interested in protecting and preserving the environment that provides for us all. And further, we acknowledge that we occupy the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, in particular the Tulalip, Snohomish, Stillaguamish, and Sauk-Suiattle tribes. We see you, we respect your right to sovereignty and self-determination, and we are committed to being better listeners and learners as we support the lifting of Indigenous voices. Thank you for your respect for the First Peoples of our land.
Thank you, Jean, very much for that introduction. Next, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Ben Thompson. He is the Urban and Community Forestry Program Manager for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. The state USCF program provides technical, financial, and educational assistance to local governments, tribes, nonprofit groups, and educational institutions across Washington. Ben holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Urban and Community Forestry and a Master of Science degree in Forest Resources and Conservation. He has also acted as a certified arborist. He lives with his wife and 2 small children in Olympia, Washington. That's where they enjoy spending time outside at the region's many parks, trails, and throughout Washington's natural areas. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, Joan. Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me here. What a way to start that. Anyway, I'm really pleased to speak with this group. I think Kate Lunsford is the first one that originally reached out to me at some point a couple of years ago, and then ever since then we've just been maintaining a conversation back and forth periodically over email. And I've spoken to this group once before, and I'm really glad to be back because we share some of the same values, right? The work that the Natural Resource Committee of the Snohomish County League of Women Voters is working on is very much aligned with the work of our program to promote urban trees and equip cities and towns and counties with the tools they need to be better stewards of that resource. So with that, I think I will share my screen here and get started. I'll say though, I have a lot of information that I'm trying to communicate in a relatively short period of time. So I will have some reference a few projects that that I can provide links to either in the chat, or probably both in the chat, and then later I can follow up and make sure that Joan gets them and can send them out to the group. Here we go. All right. So talking about urban trees and steps to sustainability. I think that, if we think about sustainability broadly, there's a lot of different dimensions of sustainability. Whether you're talking about like the energy conservation of buildings, or recycling and composting programs, or even just like the sustainability of our economy and our job market. And there's a lot of different ways you can measure sustainability. But I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll see what I see in that trees are connected to a lot of these things. Like we can build connections to a lot of the things we care about in the name of sustainability through the lens of urban trees and urban forests. So our program, we've been in place since 1990. And in that time, we've been primarily funded with federal dollars from the U.S. Forest Service, although now, thanks to the passage of engrossed second substitute House Bill 1216 this past year, we are now primarily funded with state dollars and now supplementing our budget with those federal pass-through grant dollars from the United States Forest Service. Our program is also non-regulatory. We provide technical, financial, and educational assistance to local governments, educational institutions, tribes, and 501c3 nonprofit organizations. And we also have the Washington Community Forestry Council. This is a group that is advisory to the Commissioner of Public Lands on issues of urban forestry at the statewide level. And they provide a lot of support to me and the program, and in turn, we provide support to them as well. So here's a quick snapshot of our team. That's me on the left. And then moving across the screen there is Daria Gashtala. She's our special projects and outreach specialist. Jess Lloyd in the middle of the screen is our urban forestry specialist. She's our newest addition to the team. She was just hired back in August. We also have based in Mount Vernon, or Cedar Woolley, is Jeremy Porter. He is a state lands forester for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, but we pay 30% of his time to assist with technical assistance and outreach in the northwest corner of Washington State, which includes Snohomish County, that's within DNR's northwest region. And then we have Garth Davis, who is the forester for the Spokane Conservation District, and we employ him as a contractor to provide technical assistance on behalf of our program in the greater Spokane area. So the mission of our program is to provide leadership to create self-sustaining urban and community forestry programs that preserve, plant, and manage forests and trees for public benefits and quality of life. And we're really doing that for the ecosystem services, right? Ecosystem services is still kind of a buzzword, but it basically is the things that nature does for us, where if nature were not doing it for us, it would cost us money to do for ourselves, right? So the best example that I like to use of this is that if we have a tree that's shading a building, right? That tree is providing shade in the summer, and it's reducing the overall temperature of the house, which means that if there's air conditioning in that particular building, we don't have to spend as much money and as much fossil fuels to keep that house at a comfortable temperature for people. So if all things were equal and that shade tree were gone, it would cost more money because the ambient temperature of the building would be higher without the shade of the tree. So the difference between what we would pay with the tree versus without the tree is essentially the value of that tree's ecosystem services for energy conservation. There's a bunch of other benefits that trees provide as well in terms of stormwater retention, pollution reduction, air filtration, stream shading for salmon, and protection of wildlife habitat, protection of water quality and other aquatic habitats, buffering of winds, noise reduction, and stress reduction for people. so people, we need exercise, we need to be moving. The CDC recommends moderate levels of activity to maintain our bodies healthy, and we need spaces to go do that, right? So there's a hand-in-hand relationship between the need for people to exercise and our public green spaces and trails, and even street right-of-ways, right? So if you have a sidewalk that parallels a street and there's no shade on that street, it is a less comfortable place to be, and people will be less inclined to make that journey on the sidewalk, whether they're walking or running or pushing their kid in a stroller or what have you. Whereas if that area is shaded and comfortable and clean and beautiful, then people are more likely to use it, they're more likely to get out. So there's a lot of measurable research that's been done about the benefits of urban trees to people's health. These are two websites that are both originated here at the University of Washington by Professor Kathleen Wolfe. The webpage on the left, The Human Dimensions of Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, is kind of some of her earlier work where she did some research about the benefits of trees to like local retail environments, downtowns and such. Trees and transportation, the benefits of like how trees along the street can slow traffic down, which increases safety not only for drivers, but for pedestrians and cyclists as well. And several other dimensions of research. The other website, Green Cities Good Health, is not only her research, but it's a clearinghouse of research from people doing this work around the world and their findings, right? So she has them categorized into these different groups here, and you can scroll through, click on them. It gives you a breakdown. They even tease out what they think are some of the most salient findings from that research, and they put it for you in bullet points that's already referenced to the correct article. So if you're doing your own presentation and you wanted to grab some information directly, some science-based research information about the benefits of trees to human health, you could just go right there and find that information very quickly. And this is all important because we have a lot more people that are going to be coming to our state. So currently, more than 60% of our state's population lives in an incorporated municipality, and that's according to the 2010 census. According to the 2010 census, 90% of our population lives in an area identified as urban. There's currently 7 million people in Washington state, and projections are that we'll be at 9 million by 2040. This is the equivalent of 10 new cities the size of Tacoma or Spokane by 2040. And so it's pretty clear that we're not going to see new cities prop up out of nowhere. It's the cities that we have already they're going to expand, they're going to densify, and there's nowhere else to put them at that point. So the Growth Management Act requires cities to densify within city limits to certain levels, and at which point they have demonstrated they've satisfied that densification requirement, then they may be allowed to expand into their urban growth area. Excuse me. But even still, for the good that the Growth Management Act does to prevent sprawl into the wildlands, what it means is that it puts more pressure on the trees that are already within city limits. So if we have, this is a phenomenon that's happening in Seattle and probably other places that you're familiar with as well, but if you have neighborhoods of single family homes that have been there for 50, 80, 100 years or more, and those homes get purchased, and then condos get put up that are built mostly to the lot lines, then you lose the front yards and backyards that were previously supporting tree canopy in those single family homes. And so we haven't yet really figured out how to create a sustainable balance between dense housing and green space and tree canopy. I think that balance can be found. I think we just need to do more work on it. We need to get more people to the table. We need to raise awareness of the issue. And certainly that's something that a group like yours could help assist with. And I think that's in fact what you're doing right now. Because there's a lot of values at risk, right? Everything that we have here in Washington state is essentially built on a natural resource economy. Certainly companies like Boeing and Amazon and Starbucks, like they didn't need orchards or timber or salmon or outdoor recreation to really build their brands necessarily. But it makes me wonder, would we be able to support them if we didn't already have such a strong economy that was built on our natural resources? So everything that we have and have to be thankful for, considering that this is November and we're getting ready for Thanksgiving, it's all built on Washington's natural resources, literally and figuratively. So the better we can do to protect our natural resources everywhere, not just within cities, but everywhere, then the more we will preserve our quality of life, the more we'll preserve our environmental integrity, and the more prepared we're going to be for the impacts of climate change. And that's what makes the Evergreen Communities Act good timing. And before I go any further with this, I just want to be clear that the bill that was passed just recently this past spring is not called the Evergreen Communities Act. It's called Engrossed Second Substitute House Bill 1216 concerning urban and community forestry. But it's based on the original bill, which did pass in 2008. That one was referred to as the Evergreen Communities Act. So I was with the program at that time. And so we're kind of wedded to that name, the Evergreen Communities Act. We like the sound of it. I don't know why that didn't get called that in this latest legislative session, but just know that if you're referring to the Evergreen Communities Act with folks that were maybe less aware of the fact that that's what it was originally called, they might not know what you're referring to. So since the current bill is referred to as House Bill 1216, you should probably consider using that in your talking points when you're communicating with folks. But the original bill called for a statewide inventory of urban trees, an urban tree canopy analysis pilot project, and an evergreen community recognition program. And so tree canopy analyses are a lot more common nowadays, but at the time in 2008, they were far less common. And so at the time, this was a pretty revolutionary bill to say that we're going to pilot test some tree canopy analyses in cities because virtually no one had them. We were funded for 1 year of planning work, but then the funding was swept in 2009 in the wake of the housing market crash. So after the legislature awards funding, there's a window in which they can pull it back if it's in the best interest of the state. And so people were understandably very financially nervous after the housing market crash, and the funding that we'd received got pulled back, and it hadn't been funded since then. So we submitted the bill to the legislature in 2019 with changes to the bill language. That language was supporting salmon recovery, human health, and environmental justice. And these were all three priority topics of the governor. And so that helped it get into the governor's budget, and then eventually wound its way through the state legislature, or the state House of Representatives, and the state Senate. So it was passed and signed into law by Governor Jay Inslee on May 11th this year. And so this is what House Bill 1216 does. It dedicates $2.7 million per biennium for urban forestry. And that primarily is being invested in grants for inventories, ordinances, canopy analyses, and urban forest management plans. It also funds a statewide urban forest inventory project, the Evergreen Community Recognition Program, and additional staff within DNR to both carry out this work and provide increased technical assistance to our constituents. So the biggest thing that's on the horizon here is our 2022 grant program. So typically our grants would have been announced in late September, early October, due in December, and we would have the projects awarded to start on May 1st. But because of the timing of the state dollars now, we have to do things a little bit differently. So we have now, instead of the $100,000 of federal dollars that we would typically grant, we now have $550,000 of state dollars. Now within that, 450 of that 550,000 is dedicated to equipping communities with tree inventories, canopy analyses, analysis of their tree inventory or tree canopy data, and then what they call project prioritization. So figuring out what's the most important work that needs to happen where first, and then incorporating those recommendations into work plans, maintenance plans, management plans, strategic plans, what have you. So those are the types of activities that can be funded with the majority of our available funds. And then there's $100,000 remaining, and that would go towards other types of urban forestry projects that we would typically fund, such as planting projects, work to hire consultants, develop better tree inventories, conduct public education and outreach campaigns, and other such activities. So the minimum request is $5,000, and historically our maximum request has been $20,000, but we were able to double that this year to $40,000. You can request up to $40,000 per project. We're asking for 100% match for most projects. That's when we say 100%, we mean dollar for dollar. You request $1 from DNR, you have to put up $1 in match. However, if your project benefits a highly impacted community, which is identified as a community with a census block scoring an 8, 9, or 10, according to the Washington Health Disparities Map, and I'll get into that a little bit later, and you've demonstrated that the work you're doing is there to benefit the residents that live in that area, then your match is reduced to 50%, or for every $1 that you request, you put up 50 cents of your own money, or every $2 you request, you put up $1. So eligible applicants are our core constituents, which are cities, towns, and counties, tribal governments, 501c3 nonprofit organizations, educational institutions, and special taxing districts, such as hospital districts, conservation districts, parks districts, etc. So I mentioned before, our historical timeline is shifting. So this funding coincides with the state fiscal year. So we want these projects, we want these grant applications to be due in mid-February. We want to be able to sort through them, score them, discuss them, and select projects for funding in March. We want to use April through June to develop agreements with those successful applicants and have everything ready so that the successful applicants can start their projects on July 1, which is the date that the funding for the grants technically becomes available. We're giving folks the funding, even though it's a biennial allotment from the legislature. We have the money's essentially split in half, and we have 1 year to spend half the money and another year to spend the other half. So we need to give applicants only 11 months to complete their project. And that way, if something happens and we need a little wiggle room at the end of the project to tie up all the reports and final invoices, we've given ourselves an extra month to do that. And that helps us as well at the state level to make sure that we've got our ducks in a row for reporting everything back to the state. And these grants have not yet been advertised, but we are very, very, very close to advertising them. So I was hopeful that we could have done it in this forthcoming edition of our newsletter, but it won't come out, they won't be announced there, but I'm expecting that they'll be announced within the next 2 weeks, probably. Oh, and I'll say regarding our grants, with such a huge increase in the amount of funding that we have available, we need a huge increase in applicants. So if you are one of these eligible applicants, or you know folks that work for some of these eligible applicants, we need you to help us spread the word that these grants are available, because I believe there's a pent-up demand for this, but if we don't communicate that there's actually funding available to fix it, then, or to address that pent-up demand, then people aren't going to apply, right? So especially now in this first year that the funding is available, we want to make this a really banner year for the grants. And so this is really the best year. This is the most funding we've ever awarded. We've adjusted the match requirements for these highly impacted communities. We've actually increased the scope of what could be funded because the state funding is less restrictive than the federal funding. And we've streamlined the application process to make it a little easier to apply than it has been previously. This is the Washington Health Disparities Map I mentioned earlier. If you're not familiar, this is a tool that was developed by the Washington State Department of Health. And this is a major juggernaut of an internet database that you can access online. So there's a whole bunch of data, not only demographic and economic data that feeds this map, but also data about a range of pollutants. So if you're concerned about lead or arsenic or or ozone or carbon or you name it, any number of environmental pollutants, you can find out by census block where the exposures to those pollutants are highest. So on this graphic here, the red colors are the areas with highest health disparity. The blue areas are the areas with lowest health disparity. And so we're asking all of our applicants to the grant program to explore this map and find out what their highest ranking health disparity area is in their community. And if it's an 8, 9, or a 10, you can qualify for that reduced match in our grant program. Otherwise, it would be at the standard match rate, but you would at least be aware that even though if you didn't have an 8, 9, or a 10, if you had a 5 or a 6 or a 7 was your highest score, you would learn some things about your community and learn, potentially figure out ways that urban forestry could be a tool to address some of those health disparity issues there. This is a map that we built for our Forest Action Plan. Forest Action Plan was published in 2020. And we wanted to basically create a way to prioritize where the needs for urban forestry assistance may be the greatest. So a big input to this map is the scoring, the ranking that you just saw from the health disparities map. Other data that feeds this map is a rather coarse national data set about tree canopy. It doesn't get down to the fine scale for cities to figure out their tree canopy, but it was it's the only statewide data set for canopy we had, so we used that. Also on this map, the green dots represent Tree City USA communities. The black dots represent communities that are not participating in the Tree City program. And so we use that as a proxy to say, well, if they're participating in the program, they have something going on in the way of support for urban forestry. So perhaps these areas that are not participating need more support from us. So we kind of mashed up all that information together, and on this map, the darker orange areas, generally speaking, represent the areas of higher need, and the lighter colored areas, generally speaking, represent areas of lower need. But this isn't to say that a lighter colored area here in Snohomish County has no need, right? That's not what this map is here for. The map is here for us to just get a sense of, if we were trying to invest in low-income communities, if we're trying to invest in communities of high health disparity, if we're trying to invest in communities with low engagement with our program, if we're trying to invest in communities with generally low tree canopy, those darker areas tend to be of greater need than the other areas. So when it comes to our grants, we're not using this map to prioritize where funding goes. We're using the health disparities map because that's way more rigorous and objective than this current map is here. But I brought this up though, just to say that part of our obligation in 1216 is to better prioritize where investments get made. And so this map essentially is like a prototype of what that future investment map could look like. So we have some additional staff coming on that have the GIS experience to really build this map out and add in the other data sets that we need, like data sets for salmon and orca recovery. I think that once you start putting in the data on where the salmon streams are, you're going to start to see these colors shift around a little bit. If we even use this color scheme or this, this method to sort of map the state, we might use a different method that allows us to really better assess things, because, when you start looking at the boundaries between colors, it's really hard to figure out okay, well, for down here in Yakima, for example, what the difference between these two brown colors, is it really, how far does the city go? Does it cross that line? These are all questions that we have to ask for ourselves, because we don't quite know the answer. And that's partly why we're not using this map as a hardcore decision-making tool. It's more of just a general tool for us to get a better sense of need across the state. So one of the things that we're planning to build with 1216 is the Evergreen Community Recognition Program. This program is going to be available to cities, towns, counties, and tribes. It follows the first 4 standards of the Tree City USA program, which is to have a community tree board or a designated staff person to be responsible for public trees. It requires you to have an ordinance protecting trees on public property. It asks you to track your activities and expenditures to a minimum of $2 per capita. And then it asks for a mayoral proclamation and a celebration of Arbor Day. So a mayor proclaims a particular day in your community as Arbor Day, and there's also a public celebration. But the Evergreen Communities Act goes a little bit further. It asks for all that Tree City information, but then it also asks applicants to have a tree inventory. And then there's a second tier of the program that applicants would have to have an urban forest management plan to earn the designation. So this is just kind of how it's sketched out in the bill. But when it gets to actually creating the designation, some of these things may shift around a little bit. The designation doesn't exist yet. Our first order of business is hiring an Evergreen Community Program Coordinator that will actually design this recognition program and create the web portal and create the documents that will help communicate what the standards are and how communities can apply. So, cautiously optimistic that we can create that whole program and have cities start to apply this time next year. But I don't know, because I don't know how long it's going to take to get a person hired. And I don't know how long it's going to take to create the program. We'll have to see, if there's an off-the-shelf product that we can use for a web-based application, that might make it easier. If it's something that we have to pay someone to build for us from scratch, that's going to take a lot longer. So more realistically, I think that we could have some cities that are already eligible to apply kind of piloting an application process for us by this time next year. And then the following year, 2023 would be sort of the first open year for cities to get involved in this program. So even before 1216 passed, we've been chipping away at it. So when the bill, when it was originally passed in 2008 and subsequently defunded in 2009, we weren't willing to take no for an answer. So we found other ways to try to build our program that supported the tenets of the Evergreen Communities Act. And so I would say since about, since probably about 2011 or so, we really started turning a corner on our ability to make good on that. So some current projects that we have going on, one is with the King Conservation District about promoting stormwater benefits from urban canopy cover in Puget Sound. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that project in just a moment. We also have what's called, we're calling it the effectiveness study. It's a grant we got from the Department of Ecology to actually study in a scientific way, quantifying how trees use water and mitigate for stormwater runoff. So we're measuring everything. We're measuring how much water falls on the site, how much is intercepted by the tree canopy, how much runs down the stem and is funneled to the roots, how much gets absorbed in the soil, how much the tree is taking out of the soil, how much it's transpiring and pumping back out into the atmosphere. So basically the full water cycle for individual trees. And so they're measuring this. They spent the last 2 years measuring this data on 2 different sites in the South Puget Sound area on all native trees that are kind of urban adjacent. So one is a stand of Douglas fir and big leaf maple that's adjacent to a large parking lot. Another site was kind of similarly impacted or developed, I would say. So that work is still in progress. We're trying to get additional funding to continue the research to get more than just 2 years worth of data on that and have more reliability in those results. And then there's this DNR salmon strategy. It's been given a different name since I created this slide, but basically the agency is working on a collective impact model to say, if we lined up every person in program and activity that the agency is involved in a single watershed, and we kind of stretched our abilities a little bit, like what would that look like? And could we move the needle for salmon health and recovery in any meaningful way? So that work is still being kind of hammered out within the agency, but there is definitely an urban forestry component, and they want to incorporate more about green infrastructure. So our program doesn't currently do a lot of green stormwater infrastructure work other than just supporting communities to better manage their trees. but it's possible that in the future, if the agency is successful, they could bring more money in to help communities do more green stormwater infrastructure, like engineered systems to protect or mitigate stormwater and protect local water bodies. So this project with King Conservation District, the project just finished, and these are two products here. One is a technical manual that compares two hydrologic models and like how those hydrologic models measure how well trees are mitigating stormwater. And then there's also a handbook that goes with it. So it's like, think of this as like, the technical manual is for the stormwater engineers who really want the technical, they want to see the math, basically. They want to see the methods, they want to see how it was done. And then the handbook is a lot more accessible. It sort of interprets the results for non-technical experts that want to incorporate or better connect the work they do in urban forestry with stormwater management, because we've seen a lot of success stories about how that all comes together. Also, I forgot to mention this, the DNR Salmon Strategy has selected Water Resource Inventory Area 7. So that's the Snohomish watershed. It goes from kind of on an angle across Snohomish and King County from about Everett, or actually Marysville in the far north of the watershed, down to North Bend, Snoqualmie and North Bend in the lower end of the watershed. So we've also been chipping away at our work in human health and environmental justice. So even before this year's grants that we're offering, we were nudging communities toward using the Health Disparities Map and trying to solicit projects with an environmental justice focus. We also secured 2 additional grants from the U.S. Forest Service. One we passed through to Forterra to work with schools in the Highline School District to restore some K through 12 landscapes, and that work is still in progress. And then one with Tacoma, where the city was working with the Tacoma Mall Regional Growth Center, which is a very paved part of the city and also a very low income area with high environmental health disparity. So the city was trying to work with residents to figure out what types of things they wanted to see as far as improvements to green space in the redevelopment of the Tacoma Mall area. And so that's part of a larger effort, but certainly our grant helps supplement that work to make sure that the city makes good on its promises to the residents of that area in terms of what gets installed by way of green stormwater infrastructure, tree canopy, and other green space. And of course, I mentioned our forest action plan already with this map that we built. But then the intent and best practices of the ECA, we also found ways to live up to those as well. So prior to 1216 passing, we had secured a large grant from the Forest Service that we passed through the Nature Conservancy and did a tree canopy analysis of 77 incorporated municipalities. That's every incorporated municipality in Pierce, King, and Snohomish County. So that data has just recently been collected and analyzed. It's available on iTree Landscape, which is a web-based tool that allows you to get some key information about tree canopy in your city without needing like specialized IT experience. And the data was also used to build this map from American Forests. American Forests is a national nonprofit, and they built what they call their tree equity map. And so since our canopy data was brand new, they said, oh, well, we're building this map that's based on tree canopy. Could we use some of your data? And so we said, sure. And then now we have basically these 2 mapping tools that provide different information, and both are very accessible and available on the web for people to use. One other thing is what we have our Pest Readiness project, and this is providing tools and resources for cities to develop readiness plans in the face of invasive pests in particular. So if any of you have been following invasive pest issues in this country, you know that the emerald ash borer is a really, really tragic story. Pest imported from Asia and has decimated the ash tree population in North America, basically. Now, it hasn't made it to Washington yet. We do have a native ash here. It hasn't made it to Oregon or even Idaho yet. The farthest west it is in Colorado right now, but it's really just a matter of time before it gets out here. And so we want communities to be prepared. We want them to have thought about, if this happens in our community, like what do we have going for us that could really help us? Where are the areas that were like insufficient or lacking that we can try to beef up in advance of an invasive pest outbreak? And how would we all communicate together? Who would we go to for support? So we're building those tools to help cities do that. And we also created a online tree stewards training course with the Washington State University. So this is a self-paced training class that anyone can sign up for. It's about $150, I think, and it's an entire semester's worth of information about urban trees and urban forestry and kind of horticulture-based best practices, pruning, planting, mulching, watering, tree selection, all that good stuff. And it's like, you basically, if you're interested in learning more about urban trees from sort of like an academic point of view, there's no better value in signing up for the Tree Stewards online training course. And like I said, it's self-paced, so you don't have to, you're not confined to a certain period of time to finish it. This is the just a slide to demonstrate the tree equity map here. So you can see the census blocks on the image there, and it looks not unlike the health disparities map. So there's some things that it has in common with the health disparities map, but it's different. They basically pioneered their own tree equity score, which is basically saying, you know, relative to other census blocks, what would be your score? A way to start a conversation for lay people to basically communicate to decision makers about differences in how trees are distributed in cities. Because it's not just the distribution of trees itself, but it's the distribution of the tree's benefits and who benefits from those benefits, right? Generally speaking, there is a strong correlation between tree canopy and median income. So areas that tend to be higher income also tend to be areas that have the highest tree canopy. So that also correlates strongly with health outcomes, right? So people that are higher income and live in areas with more trees tend to be healthier. They tend to have less risk of severe disease, especially respiratory diseases. But the inverse is true in low canopy areas. They tend to be low income. They tend to be communities of color. They tend to be areas that are more polluted. They tend to be areas that are hotter. Certainly in the heat wave that we saw this past summer, the folks that were more affected were the folks that lived in low canopy areas, because typically where you have low canopy, you have a high percentage of impervious cover. And that impervious cover, like asphalt and concrete, absorbs the heat from the sun and holds onto it. So, an asphalt, black asphalt can heat up to be much, much hotter than the air temperature around it, and it radiates that heat back up. So it raises the median temperature of the area right where people are moving around during the day. But then as the sun goes down and the temperature gradient shifts, all that hot concrete and asphalt starts to re-radiate the heat that it's been storing all day. And so it makes the evening temperatures hotter as well. So you end up with these prolonged periods of hotter temperatures in areas of low tree canopy and high impervious cover. They generally refer to that as the urban heat island effect. So you can almost look at the tree equity map as kind of a proxy for where you have heat islands in your city. So this is the Pest Readiness project. Phase 1 began in 2018. It allowed us to produce this Pest Readiness Playbook. This is basically a scorecard that cities can walk through to say what I was talking about before. What are the areas that we're strong? What are the areas that we need support? What would it take to get us the resources that we need to be stronger in the areas where we need to be, so that the next time an invasive pest pops up, we're going to be more prepared. And the reason this is so important is because if you can jump on it quickly, and that's why you see so much energy and effort going on with the State Department of Agriculture right now relating to the Asian giant hornet, because they know if they just dump a bunch of resources into it now, if they can eradicate it, that's the cheapest option. If they can't eradicate the pest, whether it's the Asian giant hornet or emerald ash borer or anything else, the cost and the economic toll that those pests can make based on the ways that they impact people in the landscape just goes way, way up. And the cost of that is borne mostly by by individual property owners and by local communities. So if all of a sudden emerald ash borer shows up and your street tree population is 30% ash, well then 30% of your trees are dead or dying, they're at risk of failure, they're dropping limbs, they need to be removed. But you probably haven't budgeted to remove hundreds of trees in your annual budget, right? So the cities in other parts of the country have already been dealing with this. And so the whole point of this project is that we want to get out in front of it. We want cities to be proactive with this because urban trees have it hard enough already, right? We're losing trees to drought, we're losing trees to storms, we're losing trees to development. Let's not also lose them to invasive pests. Speaking of losing trees to development, I know this group is very interested in development, so I didn't want to let this presentation slide without a few mentions of, of Treason Development. But as I mentioned before, you know, we need to do better about this. And I don't have, you know, I'm supposed to be probably the most knowledgeable person about urban forestry that's on the state's payroll, but I don't know how to solve this problem because it's so much bigger than from where I sit, because it's about housing, it's about developers, it's about the economy, it's about the environment, it's about public health, it's about community welfare and well-being. And there's just so many stakeholders. I personally don't know where to start really with this challenge, except through the thing that I know, which is trying to equip cities with the information to produce better ordinances that preserve more trees during construction. Because not only is that preserving tree canopy, but it's preserving all those benefits that go with it. So, so I want to give a mention too about large trees, because when we talk about protecting canopy, people often jump to planting, like we need to plant more trees. And that's true, we do. We need to plant as many trees as we possibly can, because as we develop, we're running out of space to put them. So the more space we can cover with trees for longer, the better we're going to be sort of like on an environmental, ecological, sustainability, sort of climate change ready place. But when it comes to the ecosystem services and benefits, most of those benefits are provided by large trees because they have bigger root systems, they have bigger canopies. Essentially, the bigger the tree, the more benefits it provides. And if you do well to care for that tree over the course of its life, it can be relatively inexpensive to maintain relative to the benefits that it's providing. So, but these large trees, we don't get to plant them in street right-of-ways because a street right-of-way, it's not big enough. It's not ever going to be big enough to support a really large tree adjacent to most streets, right? So the areas where we tend to support large trees tend to be institutional properties like colleges and universities or business parks. It tends to be city parkland, and the majority of the space is on private property. So the only time cities generally regulate trees on private property is in the development process. And if we want to protect more large trees for the benefits that they provide, then we need to do a better job about development on private property and tree retention. So the other thing I'll say about this too is that like we really can't plant our way to a stronger, denser, healthier tree canopy, because if we, you know, any one of these trees here that's been in the ground for, you know, 60 or 80 or more years, it has a very large canopy, right? And so it took decades, it took a whole person's lifetime for the tree to get to this size. But a competent tree crew can remove any one of these trees in a matter of hours. It'd just be gone, erased like it never existed. They can take out the stump, they can remove the debris, they can rake all the leaves, it'll look like it was never there. So sure, we can go and replant, but if we want to replant, we got to wait another 60 or 80 or more years for the tree we replant to get to that size. And along the way, we've got to hope that it doesn't get taken out by drought or storms or invasive pests or by, you know, the maintenance crew whacking it with the lawnmower every time they mow around it. So it's urban landscapes are hard places for trees to grow. And so if the tree has been successful and it's been there for as long as it has, like, we really need to do our best to keep that tree in the landscape to the best of our ability. Because to plant to replace that tree means putting in dozens of new trees, because we know that they're not all going to make it. And we know that it's going to take them a long time to grow. So we can mitigate for the loss of the large tree by putting in as many small trees as possible. But as I pointed out before, we're running out of room to do that. We couldn't possibly really truly replace all of the large trees that we lose with new trees that we're planting. We're trying, and that work is not insignificant, but you don't get increases in tree canopy without aggressive planting and aggressive tree protection, right? You have to do both, otherwise it doesn't work, because that large canopy just gets wiped out way too fast, and the new canopy coming back comes in way too slow. So the best tree protection measures, we've got tree fencing and wrapping the trunk and putting down mulch pads and root pruning and transplanting and all kinds of other cool stuff you can do. But it's the municipal tree requirements that really do the most for tree protection. You've got to have the tree protection ordinance. You've got to have those requirements for plans and permits. You've got to have very explicit policies, and you've got to have design standards. So, and more importantly, to do this well, you need to have someone on staff, because if you have someone who doesn't understand trees, doesn't understand what they need, how they grow, if they're a good candidate for retention or not, then all you can do is just subject permit applicants to a checklist, so that the permit applicant can say, yes, I checked that I did this thing. I consulted with an arborist, or I consulted with a landscape architect. And then the person on the other side says, oh, I see you have a report from a certified arborist, not really knowing anything about what it says or how it impacts the trees on the site. So for cities and other jurisdictions to do this work well, they really, truly need to have arborists on staff that can evaluate these plans and basically negotiate with permit applicants to get the best tree protections possible. And even then, that's hard to do too, but you get a lot more effective tree protection when you've got that person on staff. And so to connect the dots, with one of the ways that cities gain funding for urban forestry is through stormwater assessment fees. So these stormwater assessment fees are levied on every taxpayer in every jurisdiction that's subject to a permit from Department of Ecology. They call it the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit. That's the federal name for it. But yeah, the city has to get a permit every year about how much stormwater it's going to mitigate for. And then that translates into, usually it translates into the development process, but it translates into other activities as well. But the fees they collect from residents can only be dedicated to activities that reduce stormwater. And so there's been several cities in Washington that have made the case that urban forestry, investments in urban forestry mitigate stormwater. Ergo, we should be able to use stormwater assessment fees to make investments in urban forestry. And so the most recent case is in the city of Snoqualmie. They conducted a natural asset inventory of every natural asset in their community. They ran it through a bunch of rigorous calculations to figure out what the value of those ecosystem services were, specifically for stormwater. And the city council was so impressed that not only did they award them funding for their program from the stormwater assessment fees, but they got a 40% budget increase to do that work. And the nice thing about the stormwater assessment fees is that it's not subject to the whims of the general fund, because those dollars from the assessment fees can only be spent on activities that mitigate for stormwater. So the worst that could happen is that someone says, I disagree that trees mitigate for stormwater, but that's hard to do when you've got that report saying that, oh yeah, no, they do, they truly do, right? And especially with all these other resources that we're providing as well, that back up that argument that trees and stormwater are truly and meaningfully connected. So those are things that jurisdictions can apply for grants for as well. So we're really hoping to help cities really close this loop by providing the resources that we're providing. So I just wanted to give another plug for the WSU training class, and then just to get involved with master gardeners and local conservation districts. But I've taken up a lot of your time today. I know I probably didn't leave us that much time for questions, but I'd love to take as many questions as you've got. Thanks.
One of the questions is, will the slides be available? Yes, we'll try to make, Ben has promised to send us the slides, and any requests that you send to the Natural Resources team, care of me, I'm happy to make sure that those slides go out to you. So,
So Joan, I'll provide those slides as a PDF, for one, because it makes it much easier to email. And really everything that I communicated today was primarily written on the slides. So that should be sufficient for everyone.
other questions for Ben?
I also just pasted the links to those resources that I mentioned. Yeah, so Wendy, I saw your question there. So in the links that I just posted right above your question, it's the last link. So it's the one that's closest to your comment in the chat.
Megan, do you want to unmute so that you can?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to ask a question if other people wanted to ask, but I mean, we definitely see the conflict between preserving urban forestry and then allowing for development even within the UGA. But one of my biggest concerns is actually that the DNR at a state level is mandated to manage our forests, which includes clear cutting and removing a lot of trees within Snohomish County in order to provide funding for schools. So how can we make it more comfortable for you in the lunchroom at DNR if this department is required to cut down all the trees and you are working in an outreach way to try to preserve urban forestry? How do you deal with that kind of conflict where DNR is required to maintain our forests by removing them at the highest profit level possible so that they're able to fund schools?
Yeah, I would say that we aren't the only program within DNR that, on the surface level would appear to be at odds with some of the work that's done by our groups that do work in the uplands like you're referring to. But the difference there is that the folks that are managing those landscapes they're going back and they're replanting, which again is, as I talked about, the difference between a large mature tree and a tree that's planted. It takes a while to get those benefits back after the tree was planted, but those landscapes are also, they're managed specifically for timber and for profit, but they also are subject to state regulations for protection of aquatic habitat. They also have to leave trees behind periodically as seed trees, and so there's other ways that they're managing that landscape. And so the urban landscape is not managed that way, right? It's not managed as a system to generate profit and then go back and replant later. If we could, that's essentially how we're managing urban forests already, right? It's just we're taking out a lot of big trees and going back and planting a bunch of small ones. So in that way, the landscapes are being managed the exact same way. It's just that there's a lot more influence over how trees get managed in the urban landscape because you have more stakeholders, right? When the land's owned by DNR and it just has the neighbors that are directly adjacent that might have concerns about noise or trucks or, mountain bikers that are concerned about the level of cutting, it's relatively easier to manage some of those challenges in those landscapes than it is in the urban landscape.
Bill's question in the chat is, can we talk about regional tree preservation such as mountain to sound and how towns can use these as local tree loss offset programs?
I'm not sure what the question is. So Mountains to Sound, as I know it, is a nonprofit organization that is trying to protect forested landscapes but also they do some work in urban areas as well. They do, you know, tree planting projects and that type of thing. But I think that, you know, the problem with offset projects in general is that if the impact is here, right, and you offset somewhere else, then you don't address the impact here, right? So it's, if we said like, okay, mountains to sound, like if we're gonna like say, let's say we required developers to make a donation, right? Or like part of their fees that they would pay for their development application would get routed to a nonprofit like Mountains to Sound to mitigate for that elsewhere. Well, then that's great because we might mitigate for that development at a broad scale. We might protect some landscape that would otherwise be less possible to protect, but we don't address the impact at the place where the impact was made. And so that's the real challenge with any kind of offset program. I think that it's an important part of a good tree ordinance because as a person who has been a city forester and has had to help developers navigate the requirements, there are absolutely cases where at no fault of the developer, it just wasn't feasible for them to meet the code to the fullest extent. And so then we had to figure out ways that they can mitigate for that. But yeah.
I'm going to move now to some highlights from Kate Lunsford. And Kate Lunsford has been the leader of our program of work within the Natural Resources Committee for the League of Women Voters of Snohomish County. And she's also our recent past president, Jean Crevier being our present president. And she's going to share a few highlights of our Becoming an Evergreen Community effort. We didn't entitle it Becoming HB 1216, Ben, but maybe we should have. But we like to think of ourselves as becoming more evergreen by pursuing these things. And she's going to talk about a little bit, I think she's going to highlight a little bit about the significance of the American Forestry Equity Tool as well. Kate, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Ben has really said it all, and he has laid out the challenges and the opportunities, I think, so well. I just wanted to point out that we do have a tree campaign that the Snohomish County League of Women Voters has undertaken, and I put a link to the description of the kind of the three main areas of effort. One is, and I thanks so much. I thank Megan Dunn for being here today. She has submitted a policy for adoption into the comprehensive plan update that we wrote that was based on the Evergreen Community Act's implementation guide written by the Department of Commerce way back. But it is undergoing some review by county staff, and we hope to shepherd that through. And we want all of you to please be aware and be ready to support that. I think it's going to be a great framework for addressing the very challenges that Ben's talking about: significant trees, private property, housing, all of those things that come together to make it possible for us to plan a community that is really sustainable and equitable. We are also using the tree equity score to do a tree planting project in the Delta neighborhood of the city of Everett. And we got a grant from the Jackson Foundation to buy trees. And we will be working with them to canvass the area and get homeowners to agree to get a tree planted in their yard. So if you want to be involved in that, we would be happy to have you join us with that. And our other effort is these very kinds of programs where we hope to help the community understand what their role in stewardship is. I think land ownership, private property rights come with responsibilities, and we as humans trying to maintain our position in nature that's going to help us survive. So please check out the website and contact us if you would like to be involved. That's about it.
Thank you, Kate. I see Tom Tagan over there with his hand raised. He wants a little word on there. So if you want to unmute yourself, Tom, and ask, say your piece here.
All right. Well, I don't know if all of you are aware, but the county budget was passed today. The executive presented budget was passed by the county council. I did want to say a thank you to Megan and all the council members. The executive and the council together are very focused on environmental preservation and sustainability and equity and access to parks, and they are putting money to those ends. They passed a significant budget as far as DCNR is concerned, and the investments that they're talking about are one big one. A big innovation is the Land Conservation Initiative. And that will have a few $1 million put into that fund, and that's going to be leveraged against other grants and state programs, and working towards, again, tree canopy, working towards preservation, understanding more about where our green spaces are and how do we value them. And that's just one piece. I mean, Megan was probably not wanting to boast too much tonight, I suppose, but there's a number of significant ways that DCNR is going to be able to interact with League of Women Voters and virtually all of our nonprofits in the county as we move forward, as well as our city partners. I do want folks on this call to understand that we do meet as Parks and Recreation Directors. We meet pretty much monthly. There's 19 cities and towns. About 10 of those have Parks and Recreation Directors. Others may have a development person, or it may be somebody out of the mayor's office or a city administrator that participates in those meetings. So we do try to maintain very strong connectivity between our cities and the county, and then our state agencies. You know, we have just on our parks board and different boards, we have, you know, representatives of state parks and folks from various nonprofits. And so in Snohomish County, we're very focused on trying to preserve our natural environment to the greatest extent possible. That is not easy. There are always choices to be made. There's a lot of competing interests, particularly in the urban environment. So, you know, thank you for inviting me to be here, Joan and Kate. And I know Lisa's speaking next week. I'm out of town, and I'm leaving. I'm taking a vacation. I'm going to be gone and not available for 10 days. And so it was very well timed. There's Association of Washington Counties and other things going on that Megan will be active with next week and others. So it's a good time for me to be gone for 10 days. But it's a really big day in Snohomish County government. And I don't know, Megan, if you want to add any more to that, but I really appreciate her support and her insights, and the fact that she pushes hard and moves things forward. So, and all the council did. So we really appreciate them all.
Well, thank you, Tom. I think it's nice to leave on a note of positivity going forward here, because that's what we're trying to offer is positive solutions. And when the money comes towards things that we really want to do for the environment, it's always good news for us, so for all of us, actually. Thank you, Ben. What a wonderful evening. You've provided some wonderful ideas for us tonight. I know on the one side, I was very astounded with the whole idea that part of it is, I've always felt preservation was such a huge part of it. And I really love that emphasis that you brought to that tonight. So thank you very much for that portion of it. And a little bit about the pest control too. I'm a little worried about that ash board now coming in. And also I'd like to say thank you to Kate Lunsford for coming on and telling us about what we're doing here in our own community. And there are a number of Natural Resources Committee members who helped to bring all these things together tonight. Linda Matthews, who reminded me that my screen share of the PowerPoint that we all worked out so hard on earlier never showed, because Joan doesn't always have those techniques available to herself. And then Julie Winchell, who came tonight to help wrangle the questions and has shared her wonderful forested property with all of us. And of course, Jean Crevier, our president, who did such a marvelous introduction of telling what the League works is about. And also Carol McMahon for helping us to try to find the right land acknowledgement for our to acknowledge our tribes of our area. So most of all, thank you all for attending. Please spread the word of what you learned this evening. Join us next Tuesday, as Tom pointed out, for Lisa DeLune. She's the manager for the Office of Energy and Sustainability and will describe the Healthy Forest Initiative currently underway in Snohomish County. And remember, plan for trees, preserve, plant, protect, and be evergreen. Let's see you next Tuesday. And